thank you for joining me for this incredibly important webinar. We know this issue touches so many of you, but first and foremost, big welcome to the Honourable Bill Shorten, who's been responsible for this, and he's very kindly making time for this important webinar and your questions. Can I start by paying my respects to the traditional elders of the land on which we live, past, present, and the land from which all of you may well be coming from, and may we learn to live within more harmony on this land and prosper with it. Now, my team works on many dynamic community cases when it comes to NDIS, and issues when it comes to NDIS are always consistent. You know, there are problems, but it's fantastic when we can work with the department to try and resolve them. Many of you know, after the announcement of the NDIS review in late 2022, we encouraged many of you to participate in the consultation process and make submissions about your experiences, and I know many of you did. And then in May 2023, we held the NDIS forum in Manly, when Minister Shorten actually came in person, which was an amazing evening, and we had over 300 people attend to discuss their experience and concerns. Following the findings of the NDIS review, the government and the minister has now introduced the new legislation, and it will come into effect on the 3rd of October. There are two main parts to the legislation, and it will change how participants interact with the NDIS. And then secondly, it will give greater powers to the Quality and Safeguards Commission to ensure greater participant protection, which is incredibly important. So for this important conversation, of course, very delighted to welcome the Honourable Bill Shorten, the Minister for the NDIS, and he's played a key role in establishing the NDIS back in 2013, and now the task of improving it and making sure it's fit for purpose and sustainable. And so we've taken a lot of questions from many of you as you've registered for this webinar, and I'm going to go through most of those questions with the Minister, and I look forward to all of your feedback. Now, today, the point is a positive, constructive discussion about the NDIS with the questions you've put in and some of the ones that have been brought to my office as well. And we'll have an opportunity to take more feedback from you after this webinar. So, Minister, here we are. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks very much, Zali. And I know this doesn't need to be said, but I think Warringah is very well represented, and people should be conscious that whether or not it's the government or the opposition, Zali always stands up for her electorate. With the National Disability Insurance Scheme, I want it to be here to stay. I think it's changing lives. I think it's doing a lot of great things for people. I remember campaigning for its establishment between 2008 and 2010. It was finally legislated, and the first 4 trial starts started in 2013. Since then, it's grown. There was 9 years of coalition government, and then 2.5 years ago, I got the amazing privilege to be the minister. The challenge for the scheme is that it was growing faster than I think anyone forecast. There was always unmet need out there, and I think that was expected. But in the financial year 21-22, it was growing at 23%, with an extra 15% of people being added onto the scheme. So the fear is that if we don't work out why it's growing so fast and don't work out how we can perhaps grow it at a lower rate, it should still grow. The NDIS is one of the great investments by the government and through the generosity of Australians, recognising that disability is universal. It could be any of us or someone we love at any time. This scheme was designed to provide support for people who are permanently and profoundly impaired so that they can have more fulfilling lives. Since we got elected, there's been a whole lot of work going on. We promised at the election in 22 that there would be a full review. There has been. We also have looked at how we can get people out of hospital more quickly, how we can decrease the rate of disputation and people having to go to the AAT. We've revamped the leadership of the scheme. We've also put a lot more money into going after the scammers and the fraudsters and improving the payment system. Since the review got handed down in December of 2023, We've been doing work on how we sort out the fact that 92 providers are unregistered, which is not a realistic option anymore. And we work out how we can make the scheme more human and less traumatic to deal with, and that's what our recent legislation is about. What can you spend on the scheme? How can you make sure the initial plans are done properly? Making sure the people providing the services are delivering quality. Also, the big thing which the review said is that the NDIS can't be the only lifeboat in the ocean. Or in other words, we've got to start building supports for people whose disabilities mightn't require the full NDIS support, but still need support. And that's what we're doing work with the states now. We've made quite a few breakthroughs with the states to get that moving. Why don't I leave it there, Zali, because I'm sure there's lots of questions and answers, questions and maybe answers. But let's hear from people.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I've got the questions here because obviously we were worried about technical difficulties. But a first area I wanted to touch on was the needs-based assessments. And obviously there is going to be changes in that respect in the new legislation. So could we maybe go through those changes to the needs-based assessment process?
Well, one very important change that the new legislation's now given the legal authority for is that we'll assess the person at the whole of person level, not each individual item. At the moment, people know every item gets haggled over, and that can be counterproductive, can be draining, it requires a whole lot of reports, and it can slip into adversarial too easily. We will work out needs assessment tools over the next 12 to 18 months, and we've given ourselves up to 5 years to transition to everyone being on the new needs assessment approach. We'll need 20 or 25 different needs assessments because not everyone's the same, and we'll be co-designing them. So nothing changes overnight with regards to needs assessment, but we want to look at the whole person and their needs rather than just this current system where we imagine if you were building a house. At the moment, we're arguing about every brick, every windowsill, every tap. And what we want to do is just look at the whole person's needs. We've got to train up the workforce, recruit the workforce. None of this happens overnight or without co-design.
That's good to hear, I think, for participants, that it's not going to happen overnight, and that, the gradual process, I think, is important for people to have that confidence. Now, you mentioned in the intro, obviously the plan of keeping it sustainable because the current trajectory of growth was just not sustainable from a budgeting point of view. Obviously participants are concerned when the news hits that there's $14 billion to be cut in spending. Now, I know we've discussed that this is around efficiencies, but maybe for participants to understand a little bit more where those cuts in spending will come from.
Well, I'm going to correct the language of cuts. What it is that if we didn't change anything about the scheme, we estimate that we would spend $225 billion over the next 4 years. I'll just repeat that number, $225 billion. That's the budget of Western Australia for the next 10 years, like everything. Instead, we think that if we run the scheme better, we'll outlay $211 billion. Or put another way, we're assuming the scheme is going to grow at about 11% next year in investment cost, and we want to get it down to about 8% or 7.5% growth over the next 4 years. So that's not a cut, but no one's going to convince me there's not money being wasted. We've got many service providers do a great job, but you've got some who are just scamming people. We've got people spending money on stuff which the scheme was never designed to spend. We've got other government programs who push things onto the NDIS when they should be picking up the tab. We're optimistic that just by treating people as human beings, by having clarity on what you can spend money on and what you can't, by gradually working on new needs assessment, look at the whole person's needs, that we won't have to fork out $225 billion, but we are assuming growth in the scheme every year for the life of the scheme. So I get people get anxious, and I respect that. And there's, social media, if you're ever having a good day, go and read social media. That's bound to depress you. But there's a lot of misinformation out there.
That's a really good pickup, because that's my mistake. We shouldn't be framing it as cut. It's just a reining in the increase, which is sensible and makes it sustainable. Now, another area that does get raised now, what I know it was in 2023 when you came up, was that question around people with permanent disabilities, and that they were required to complete regular plan reviews. So obviously that's incredibly frustrating for participants, but also very inefficient and ineffective. So why do participants with permanent conditions need to regularly go through such a time-consuming, confronting process? Now, I guess a proposal put forward is, could we have 5-year plans instead of 1-year plans, appreciating that sometimes needs change, but when they are clearly permanent disabilities, how well is that now going to be reflected?
The legislation which we passed has a section, and it's section 33. This will allow us to have longer than annual plans. It is demeaning for someone with, say, use a classic example, who's blind. It's demeaning to have to keep proving you're blind, or that you're still a quadriplegic, or that you have Down syndrome. So we now have the capacity with our new planning framework for the agency to approve plans up to 5 years.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. That is a...
It's not going to happen overnight, but it should, and we've now got the legal ability to do it in a way which we didn't have beforehand. And we've got to get the right tools. It's got to be done by Codesign. But absolutely, there's questions which you ask annually which are just a waste of time, money, and they're demeaning.
Okay, and so in that part of the co-design process with all the NDIS changes, one area that people are concerned about is that the consultation process and their opportunity to contribute is not be tokenistic. How are you going to make sure that process, that consultation process, the co-design, works well and gets people's engagement?
The NDIS has a board. Board of directors. They're actually appointed by a majority of the states and territories in the Commonwealth. The board will keep things honest, and half the people on the board are now people with lived experience. We've got now 23 co-design groups in the agency. There's also an independent advisory committee to the agency, where you've got a lot of very strong-minded people with disability. So the board, the independent advisory committee, MPs like yourself, 23 co-design groups, and we also strengthen the legislation which requires co-design as a sort of basic design principle of anything we do, and that hasn't always been the case in the first 10 years of the scheme.
Okay, that's again really good to hear. Now, another area which I know your office, your electoral office, my office, many experiences sometimes the delay. Why is the process of confirming the NDIS access? It is taking longer than the mandated 21 days, particularly since the introduction of the new PACE system in October last year. So participants and providers have observed delays worsening over time, and I know often that is staff shortages, but I think people would like to hear from you, a bit more about that delay on the mandated 21 days.
Yeah, I'm sorry that people are experiencing delays. That's the first thing I want to say. One of the things we didn't change from the last government is the decision to have a new PACE system. That's been rolling out. That's meant that as people learn to use that, we've got slower. It's been slower, but as people get used to it, that will speed up. There's also, because we've been talking about reform, been a flooding of extra claims and plan reviews and variations. Some of them are genuine, but the number from this time last year to now, it's doubled. And we can't treat any claim as vexatious, but we have been flooded by some plan managers, some support coordinators, not many of them good, but some of them just having a lens trying to squeeze it out. And we've got to take every application seriously. We've put on 2,000 extra people since I became the minister, but that takes time to train up people. So there's new tech. There's been a sense of anxiety. You better rush, change something now because for good or bad reasons that won't be available. And so that's led to an increase. we've been surging our workforce to try and deal with it. I hope that we're over the hump in between July and now. I hope that we're beginning to see the times decreasing again. But we've been absolutely swamped. There was a 13% increase in access decisions in the second quarter of this year. The number of plan approvals were up in the second quarter of this year by 81%. The number of reassessments up 38% from the first quarter to the second quarter this year. That's because in some cases people genuinely their plans weren't done properly or they have a bit of variation. But also we're seeing some rubbish claims coming in, but we've got to treat everything seriously.
Yeah, no,
so
absolutely.
I think it's quite...
Now, okay, one area that we do get feedback is a little bit of that early process. So while waiting to gain access to the NDIS, participants are often notified by SMS that the NDIS will call them within an hour. But unfortunately, that SMS doesn't mention that it's for their planning meeting. So it doesn't leave them much time to prepare or arrange representation. So many are giving me the feedback that this feels rushed. How can this rushed approach maybe be improved to ensure participants have adequate support when they get that SMS notification that their planning meeting is coming?
Yeah, you'd hope that 1 hour communication is at the end of a chain, letting you know that there's a reassessment rather than the first you've heard about a reassessment. So I can understand if that's the first someone's heard, that's completely undesirable. The agency and local area coordinators are expected to check in with people 2 months before reassessment date outlined. And if they're not doing that, then we need to know and we need to keep pushing that. Also, if things are going well and no changes are needed, the agency may renew your existing plan for a longer duration. And by the way, after any check-in, the agency should be sending a summary of what's talked about for starting the next steps that are agreed upon. But I agree with the complaint. If you're just hearing for the first time an hour before you're going to be reassessed, that's not a good way of operating. And you send us some of those examples but there is an expectation that the agency and the local area coordinator should be letting people know 2 months before.
Yeah. Okay, we'll make sure we'll get onto that process. Now, you touched on a bit of maybe, people taking advantage of the scheme. And we see that, concern is that comes from providers as well as participants rorting the scheme. And that unfortunately undermines it for everyone that really needs it. How are you combating that? As you said, you can't take anything as being vexatious. Everything has to be assessed. Is there a process of like a information line or a reporting line? How are you going to combat that rorting of the system?
Well, the first thing to say is that when I talk about rorting of the scheme, some service providers get offended and send me angry text messages saying they're being demonised. Most people are doing the right thing. That is my view. And as I said at the outset, the very first sentence I ever say about the NDIA or the NDIS is it's changing lives for the better, hundreds of thousands of lives. But just because many service providers are doing the right thing doesn't make it a crime to call out the ones who aren't. And I'm going to keep calling it out.
Absolutely.
So if you still want to tell me that I'm a bad person for calling it out, knock yourself out. I'll read your email. But you won't convince me because there are scams going on. So under the sort of umbrella heading of unethical conduct, at one end you've got the crooks. Ghost claims, claims put in for services never delivered. Then you move through to claims which are overcharging. A service provider might charge weekend penalty rates, apparently all during the week in their invoice, not that the worker was receiving penalty rates all week. Then you've got services which are just too expensive. And one of the things which I've worked out with the ACCC and we have new regulations for is just because your kid is on the NDIS and you have to cancel at 48 hours notice doesn't mean you should be charged a bigger cancellation fee than if your kid wasn't on the NDIS and had to cancel at 48 hours notice. So what we've seen is the price guide's been used as a minimum, and we're seeing some businesses charge for the same services to people outside the scheme far less. You're not allowed to charge two prices just because someone's on the NDIS. Now, if the person has more complex needs, that's fine, but that's not the problem, what we were talking about. So we've the other thing is the payment system never used to get checked. You might be interested to know, Zali, and people on the webinar, but before I became minister, if you put in a claim between 9 and 5, and there would be tens of thousands of claims a day, 20 would be checked. If you put your claim in between 5 and 6:30, your invoice that is, none of them would get checked. And sometimes they wouldn't get checked for months and months and months later. And perhaps the person's just made an innocent mistake, but then it becomes a debt issue. And, now we check thousands of claims beforehand. We've moved 140 people in the agency just to do pre-checking so that we can make sure that what's being claimed is right. We found invoices and payment systems where people were claiming $20,000 and $30,000 a hit with no evidence. So that doesn't mean that's wrong, but I'll tell you what, that's not a good system. So we're investing in the ICT. The Safeguards Commission had 367 employees when I became minister. They've now got 1,000 because complaints, people would make a complaint and they'd never hear about it again. That's not a complaint system. We've also invested, people might be shocked to realise that different government agencies don't talk to each other. You could live in different countries for all the communication that was going on. And we did 900 of the smallest plan managers and anonymised their data and compared it to the ATO data at last. And 343 of these plan managers had never declared any income. So for the people who say I shouldn't talk about the scams, you're actually hurting the scheme, and it gives a bad name to everyone else. But as I say, I want to return to where I started. We're now doing investing in the proper payment systems, the investigation systems. We do want to register most of the providers, but we've got to make sure the registration is not red tape. It's got to be risk-based rather than just one size fits all. But we need to know what's going on, because how can we support quality outcomes for people? And we all know that you can go on some websites and they sell NDIS businesses with the person. I've seen it on, I think Gumtree took it down, but other websites where they will sell the person. Essentially, they say this person is in a house, they have a $300,000 package, buy the business. Like these are people, not human ATMs.
Yeah, no. Look, I would say the feedback I have from the community welcomes scrutiny to make sure that, that it's the sustainability of the scheme, but also that those that are needing it get what they need and it's not getting wasted unnecessary. So that's fantastic. So one area that is a tough one is around home modifications, where when applications for home modifications get rejected. And as a result, I've had one participant contact me and say need to then move into specialist disability accommodation. But unfortunately, there was none locally available. So that does raise that question around shortage in the SDA. What's happening in that space?
The NDIS invests over $2 billion in SDA accommodation, but I do get there's a problem with shortages. And I've got some specific instructions here, which I'm just going to look down and read. If you've got funding for SDA in your plan and assistance is required to find the appropriate dwelling, they could utilise the support of their support coordinator. The support coordinator should be able to, through their knowledge, should be able to identify vacancies in existing SDA dwellers, have discussions with builders of new dwellings. But what the NDIS has also developed is an online tool called SDA Finder. It's interactive. It's maintained by the NDIA to assist participants. Vacancies can be located by searching with multiple filtering options. And vacancies, that could include location, building type, maximum price per person. If the SDA you prefer to reside in is not available, can look at other locations, different size SDAs until the one you are seeking becomes available. I mean, it is a fact that we have a housing shortage generally in Australia, and this is no exception. we would market stakeholders to develop high-quality, fit-for-purpose SDA. That means publishing data on supply and demand for SDA, locations being sought by participants. It's no good someone building SDA in a suburb that no one wants to live in or that has no shortage. During 2023, we did the first comprehensive review of SDA pricing arrangements, and that was released halfway through last year to guide market investment, because we've got investors who want to look. But I just say to people who want to make investment, be careful, not all that glitters is gold, and that there's shonks out there promising mega returns on SDA, and that's not always the case.
Yeah, and I should say, I've been meaning to have you up actually in person to visit our beautiful beaches, but we have some fantastic SDA accommodation, North Manly, North Bargalla, where I've visited, incredibly modern. It's a sort of that co-living arrangement where the common areas are shared, but the rooms are individual, high level of care, really, really incredible quality around those. And I'll put up the links and some photos of when I visited actually for participants to have a look, which is really great. But it is such a major issue that participants needing that specialist accommodation not have to move so far away from their support networks and their families. And when I visited, that was such a key part. It was a local family, and it really meant a lot for that to be able to be done. In terms of another question,
sorry, I should just say, we know it needs to improve, but I just remind people what life was like before 2013. Like, the idea that people could move out was in most cases a fairy tale. We had young people stuck in aged care. So yeah, we've got to do better. Absolutely accept that. But I also look at how far we've come compared to where we were, where waiting lists were crisis, and the only way you could find accommodation was for today to be worse than yesterday and for tomorrow to be more of a bin fire than today. And I'm not saying we've got it right yet, but it is, no government in the world invests what we're now doing in the NDIS, trying to find out curated specialist disability accommodation.
Yeah, and absolutely. And look, it is incredible. It is life-changing for the families and the participants. It makes such an amazing difference to quality of life, but also participation in activities for all involved.
Yeah.
The one I was referring to actually is the Manly House, run by Tom Oates, but I'll put up a link later about that. One of the areas that is still that improving the length of time it takes to be granted access to the NDIS. So I've been told I should not, so this is from a person putting their question in, I've been told I should not expect feedback for another 6 months due to the backlog of current applications, but they need support now. Is there a fast track process or a way in which early support is available pending full assessment? It is a problem when that delay, and I know it's about putting on more staff, and I always urge people to just be patient, and obviously everyone is doing their best, but how do we sort of start to fix this problem?
We are trying to upgrade the access issue from about the 30th of October last year, in line with broader changes to making the NDIA more user accessible. Part of that change now, families and people requiring support now first contact what's called their partner in the community to learn of community and mainstream supports that are available, and if required, to be able to apply for the NDIS. So there's partners and communities covering every part of Australia. Once an application to the NDIS is made and with supporting evidence, including, by the way, we're now asking for evidence of identity. It wasn't always asked for in the past. Once that's submitted to the community, the NDIA determines if the application is complete, whether or not it meets the eligibility requirements in the Act, which was introduced 11 years ago. Now, supporting the applicant to gather and provide all the information up front as part of the application process does take time, and it's a change for the community, the agency, and the partners in community. It is taking time as we go through that transition. When families or people connect with a partner in the community, the partner in community, these are not-for-profit organisations by and large. They have to finalise a community connections plan. The plan is not mandatory. It's not required for the NDIS, but we think that's what we want these partners in community to do as well. When a person asks to apply for the NDIS, the partner in community has to support the person, gather the evidence, verify the identity, and submit it. Now, the access delegate's meant to take 21 days from when we get the complete application. I've explained that we're getting a massive surge of applications. As I say, some very meritorious and some much more speculative and opportunistic. So we're trying to really triage the waiting lists. And the funny thing is, it's not funny if you're waiting, but the ironic thing is I think during COVID, everyone thought, well, there was a surge in demand for services, not just in the NDIA, but hospitals, Veterans Affairs, Centrelink, Services Australia's Medicare. The reality is that that demand hasn't gone back to the pre-COVID levels. And there's just a lot of people out there who are seeking the support of government, and at the same time we're trying to digitise services. Not that you can't have real people to talk to, but where you can get an answer online, we ultimately want to be able to give answers online to save time. But for these applications, of course, it's a human decision and a human engagement. And that's why we're redoing the needs assessment.
Okay. So I've got a question here. My Tim hasn't told me the name, so I'm very sorry to who it is. As a single mother with a full-time demanding corporate job and a young daughter with severe intellectual disabilities, it took me months to put together her NDIS application. It was an incredibly stressful and time-consuming process, which meant I had to miss out on important family time and moments with my daughter. Her application was successful, although she was only given a one-year plan, and then we will need to complete a plan review. My question is, how can we make this process easier, especially for parents? Is there any way the NDIS can better help parents navigate the process?
Yeah, well, first of all, the process has been too complex. You practically need a PhD in NDIS, and heaven help you if English is not your first language, or you've got other things going on in your life which make it a lot harder to be able to apply. So it's too complex. So there are things we can do for parents. The review said we needed to have a coherent pathway, so we are changing the access process. Future pathway needs to be clearer on who the NDIS is for and what evidence is required. There's inequities in the current system. I mean, eligibility shouldn't be determined if you can afford to get, a tip truck full of evidence, whether or not the treating professional uses key magic words, which don't exist, but key terms and phrases, or just relying on a diagnosis alone. Another recommendation of the NDIS is to ensure that participants and parents get more support from a navigation function. We are currently working on how we introduce specialist navigators to the scheme. This might be a sort of something which a really good plan manager might have helped you with, or a support coordinator. We want to have quite a lot of navigators available, not necessarily employed directly by the agency, but all who are trained to a high standard and credentialed by the agency. And you can go to a navigator and they just help you get your act together. And you've got a human being to talk to about what you need and how you do it. I'm also open that for some of the initial reports that the government pays, you don't have to sort of race around and get all your reports, pay for all of them yourself. We're still working that out. But any of this that I'm talking about, having a specialist navigator, a person you can go to, we've got to trial it, refine it, test it, got to work with parents, got to work with some of the existing very highly qualified and skilled support coordinators and plan managers before we roll out the navigators fully. I mean, this is stuff which ideally would have been done 5 years ago. It hasn't been, but we've now got what the new laws that we passed give us the authority to start doing all of this work.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, on many of the problems we've and areas that we've touched on, an area that really matters a lot to my community and to many communities around the country is actually the First Nations gap, because for many, and the review certainly found this, that for First Nations communities, they face a persistent service gap and often lacked access to culturally safe services. And unfortunately, the statistics also show that Indigenous Australians are 1.5 times more likely than non-Indigenous Australians to have a disability or a restrictive long-term health condition, so need the program all the more. I don't have the data around from a multicultural point of view, where non-English speaking and how their access to the system impacts as well. But certainly for Indigenous Australians, it was clear from the review that when they have a disability or a restrictive long-term health condition, it is really hard for them to access. So what's NDIS doing through the review to ensure participants living in remote First Nations communities especially have local, culturally safe and accessible disability services?
Well, the first couple of things we've done go towards, I think, leadership. We've appointed the first ever First Nations person to the board of the scheme. Until I came along, they'd never had one. He's Dr. Richard Fijo, a Larrakia man from Darwin. What we've also done is the CEO has some deputies. We've appointed the first ever Deputy CEO Indigenous. That's Janine Muhammad. She was, I think, Victorian of the Year, by the way. She's a well-known leader right around Australia. So we've got First Nations people at the very top of the agency. So that just means it's not a last paragraph of a press release sort of issue. It's embedded into how we think generally about the whole scheme, how are First Nations people getting an equitable access. In the last budget, so not the one which just happened, but the one before, we put in millions of dollars for 2 years to pilot alternative commissioning. So the idea that every person is going to have their own plan and find their own professional from Darwin or from Cairns, for example, or from Perth, it's ridiculous. One, the services aren't there, and two, if they do, they're paying for the airfares and not proper services. So we're looking at alternative commissioning. We've started doing that in Maningrida and I think Kununurra, where we want to see are there local organisations who could get some funding to employ some of the common services which people on the scheme need and embed them locally rather than fly in, fly out. For what it's worth, we also have 24 offices of the NDIA in remote, very remote and non-partnered locations across Queensland, the NT, South Australia and Western Australia. We're also building up a pool of dedicated remote planners because the issues are special and different. Some issues are common, but some issues are special and different. Currently, I've got 217 staff at the agency in remote servicing teams who are just dedicated to supporting remote and very remote locations. We're also got a system of, we've invested 20 million for early childhood and remote community connectors. So that supports our remote community connectors, support 418 remote communities. We're looking at how we can expand the community connector program. Currently we have, the Northern Territory has 10 services where we support 112 remote communities. Queensland has 14 service partners where we support 53 remote communities. South Australia has 3 service partners where we're supporting 63 communities. And Western Australia has 11 service partners supporting 252 remote communities. We're also working with participants and advocates to implement place-based solutions in remote locations. What I mean by that is we're looking at working in line with closing the gap priorities to transform government organisations, and the NDIA is working with other government agencies to do that. We want to make sure that we have some of our remote planners are geographically tied to regions, so you can have the same person constantly, which is probably a pretty good idea in the cities too. But we want to make sure that, so we are investing in it. We report the data. We're very conscious of the particular issues that First Nations people might experience in trying to access the scheme. Now, I get the package, but if you can't spend it, then what is good as the package.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so that's really good to hear, because it is really important, that feedback. And I know also from the SDA aspect of housing for more remote communities as well, making sure there is SDA housing in remote, like the whole suite of services needs to be sort of, I guess, a special lens to ensure it's also available in those more remote communities. Now, I'm going to pivot to one more question. We've all been really excited in recent times to watch the Paris Paralympic Games, right? They were so exciting, incredible, just courage, just that showing what the human spirit can do. I mean, some of the performances are just mind-boggling and phenomenal. And I think it really inspired a lot of Australians just around the feats of some of the participants at the Paralympic Games. But what's been interesting is I've recently had a chance to talk to leaders within the Paralympic movement, and they say, look, they're a bit concerned. There's a bit of a disconnect then with NDIS participants, and actually there's been a drop-off of people participating in Paralympic sports because through the NDIS process, they've had to choose between central therapy or having the time to fund all their sporting ambitions, which seems like I guess, like a really sort of a negative outcome, because I would say the Paralympics is the ultimate achievement of anyone with, any NDIS participant, is being able to get to that next sort of the ultimate elite level of Paralympics. So that question between sport versus central therapy, what are you doing maybe to support participants of NDIS to also ensure they can also go into sport, and that we have a strong pipeline of athletes for the 2032 Brisbane Games? I mean, that's one aspect, but sorry, just making sure that we're not sort of having a system, I guess, block that sort of would be a really, would be a shame.
Yeah, I think well, obviously we'll talk to the Paralympics Committee, but of course we've got former Paralympian who's chair of the NDIA, so I'm sure Kurt's all over this. In fact, I managed to attend the Paralympics in Beijing in 2008, and that was one of the things which helped form my view about the NDIS, because for those 12 or 13 days in Beijing, people weren't looking at people based on their disability, but, what country are you from? What event are you in? Everything was designed right so people could get around. And it was about as equitable a moment as you get, where people looked at someone's accomplishments and not what their perceived deficits might be. And I remember thinking at the time in August of 2008, well, if we can do this for 14 days every 4 years, why not every day of 1,400 days between Paralympic events? So part of the motivation that I had for the NDIS is to allow people to live fulfilling lives. So we do see, I'll see what the Paralympics are actually saying, but I'm going to question a little bit. Before the NDIS, these Paralympians were getting nothing or very little. I'm sure that the scheme is turbocharge them. But an interesting point also here is, so yeah, if you want to, if one of your goals is to do more participation in terms of recreation, then this scheme will support you in some of your disability supports you need. But part of the challenge also is what's everything else that's being done to help our Paralympians, and it shouldn't just be the NDIS to be like Atlas carrying the world on its back. The federal government, though, did split Olympic funding 75% Olympic, 25% Paralympic, which is the highest proportion the Paralympians have ever had. And I know that I was involved in getting Melbourne's Paralympian base established at the Essendon Football Club out at Tullamarine, and the only way Essendon Footy Club was going to get its funding was if the APC, the Australian Paralympics Committee, got resources too. So I think it's always a work in motion, but I've got no doubt. Well, I'll chat to the Paralympians. I saw them when they came back. A lot of great heroes and role models there. but I'll also chat to Kurt about the issue that you're raising with me, because Kurt is not backwards in coming forward, and nor is you,
I
Zali.
know Kurt. We're all Olympians are very keen to speak our mind. You did touch on actually talking about Paris and the Paralympics, was that 14 days where people could get around, all the systems were working as they should. And transport is an issue that is raised a lot, especially here in New South Wales. We do have and it is part of that work you're doing around, federal responsibilities, state responsibilities. Disability transport is a tough one, and I know I've written to you about, maybe participants being able to pool their transport allocations so that maybe a SDA provider could, for example, purchase a common vehicle for all the residents. But transport is an issue. We have a shortage here, and this is Sydney. I can't even begin to imagine in regional areas when it comes to disability taxis, and they end up being at exorbitant prices. I've actually got one local resident who has started his own disability taxis, red taxis, to be able to service this area. How are we going to improve transport when it comes to the disability transport access?
Well, as you realise, my empire of the NDIS doesn't extend to every other portfolio or every other level of government. States have got some big obligations in transport access. Also, the private sector has. It's funny that we've got to set regulations to tell the private sector how to treat customers. You sort of would have thought it was a business proposition. Now, recent aviation reforms are now going to see, I think, a lot better experience at airports for people with disability. It requires investment. It also requires constant vigilance. With our plans, we do provide some support for transport, but I also, and some support for remediation of vehicles. But yeah, again, the whole community's got to stand up here and say we want better ferry access or better bus access. Or, I was involved in setting up the standards for private sector buildings. We've still got a government or two at the state level to agree on to our disability standards for public sector buildings. I mean, things are improving, but I agree it's a constant fight. And when the taxis get cancelled and people are kept waiting, and when people are treated unfairly, we've got to speak out about it, because it drives me wild. Because there is a basic human right to be able to get out and about. And if you can't access a building, or if you can't access a service because of the transportation, then you're being denied a human right.
Yeah, no, it's a big one, and we've got a couple of late questions that have come in, so they're not too curly, so it's all, they're good ones. But when someone's had a plan denied or denied access, there's an appeals process, and a review process can be lengthy and difficult to navigate, and that can create financial strain. How are you going to, maybe the appeals process for people to understand, can that be streamlined, and also, getting timely resolutions of that?
Yeah, there's a few ingredients in that. I'll go with the good news first, but if you're currently in an appeal, you might think it's good news, but overall it should still be said. The average waiting time at the AAT before I became the minister was like 32 weeks. Now that's down to about 17 weeks. We like to sort out, the best way to avoid an appeal is get that initial decision right. That's why we're moving to a new form of needs assessment, new form of budget planning. That'll take a little while to roll out. We've also, for internal reviews, when I first got in, we looked at all of the waiting list of cases. There were about 4,500 at the AAT. And I hired specialist mediators and sat down with the legal team, and I said, I don't want to be arguing over stuff which is going to resolve. So if it was small scale, or if it was there'd just been too much of an attitude of litigation from my predecessors, I said, just settle it, resolve it, let people get on with their lives. So of the legacy cases, there's barely 5% left. In fact, at one point we became victims of our own success, because more people decided to go down the path, because we're resolving things more quickly there than just trying to talk it through. I've asked the agency to adhere to being a model litigant. That means that there's certain ways to behave. Also, we're trying to get better explanations for decisions. Because people, if you don't know why the decision's been made, that's just bad. And it's not useful to you or the agency deep down. So we're trying to improve the quality of decision making, the transparency of it. But I know we've got a way to go. But I know, again, we want to do better than we're doing. But from where we've been, it is better. The other thing is we want to clarify what you can spend money on the scheme, because that way it just avoids mistakes.
Yeah, no, for sure. Now, one final issue that I have raised in the past is that age discrimination for once you turn 65, and the difficulty we have. The NDIS cuts off at that point if you can't access NDIS over 65. Of course, we've seen now last week the announcements by the government around the complete revamp of the aged care sector, and that there will be new aged care plans. I appreciate it's not your portfolio, but obviously that cross section between NDIS, if you're 65 and you turn, when it cuts out, and then aged care kicks in, and that accessing some disability support. Is there anything you can update people about that process? I know it's not going to be parity financially, but it is the review of the aged care system is actually going to introduce a little more flexibility, additional levels of plans, and a little better. It's not as good as NDIS, but it is better. Is there anything you'd like to maybe say on that front?
Yeah, the reason why there's a different scheme for below 65 and 65 and above is that when I was campaigning to create an NDIS, every aged care was superior. What happened, though, is that somewhere along the line, aged care atrophied and NDIS, for all of its imperfections, got better. And NDIS was never designed for everyone over 65 because there's a lot of Australians with disability over 65. And if we incorporated all of them into the NDIS, we'd lose the NDIS. But part of the solution is if you're on the NDIS, you can keep some of those services past 65. And the other part is, of course, there's now overdue, but I think very promising overhaul of aged care, which looks at more levels and looking at how we can provide better support for home care. And I think that'll comprehend the cost of disability better than has been comprehended so far.
Yeah, look, I'm obviously getting briefings by the Minister in that respect, and I'll give everybody a bit more update as we get more information. Yeah. And I will definitely engage and put pressure to make sure there is sufficient funding on that front. Now, we are pretty much out of time. It's been a fantastic chat. Thank you so much for your time and for your passion around this, because, it has to be said, we've had lots of meetings in Parliament, and from being part of, instigating it back in 2013 to now picking it up again and bringing it back through the review to bigger and better and fit for purpose. It is great to see. Really appreciate your support. Mr. Shorten, of course, we're going to be losing you to politics shortly, but the sector, I think you've definitely, really put the sector into a good condition. There's one last little thing I will say is we recently had an event in the Speaker's Courtyard in Parliament House for the Minerva Network, which was a mentoring for women in sport and Paralympic sports, and there was no ramp in the Speaker's Courtyard for guests that came in wheelchairs. So that is something. No, it's not the current Speaker's fault, but we will be raising that question of making sure the People's House of Parliament is fit for all Australians to come to Parliament. We need to make sure the People's House is the best house.
When I was the Junior Minister for Disabilities, I realised that a lot of the carpet was crap for wheelchairs, and the doors are very heavy, and there were very few sliding doors. So I campaigned. It took me years to get better doors and better access, and it just goes to show that with previous speakers, you wonder how many people wheelchairs ever visited the Speaker's Courtyard. So it's good that the current Speaker's getting people in there. But yes, Parliament House was built in the 1980s. Whilst there were some disability standards, the building, reflects the best ideas of 1985 or 1982, and we've advanced since then. So I know how difficult it was to argue for automatic doors in the building, and so it's good that you take up that challenge. And as for myself, I love the NDIS. and I'm still around. We'll still keep arguing. If something's wrong, we'll call it out.
Thank you
As
so
you do.
much. Okay, we're right on time. To everybody, we've had many participants today. We will send out a link to the recording and some useful links of resources that have been mentioned by the Minister today, and anything else that's come up. If you've got any further
Can you see my
questions,
bulldog?
please remember.
Can you see my bulldog in the background? My bulldog in the background.
Yes. What's his name?
Walter.
Walter's saying, come on. Fantastic. Okay, well, Bill and Walter, thank you so much for your time.